source loops and one-shots to create the ambience for your game, you'll probably come across a problem. Although you've got control over the attenuation of these sounds, and you have different attenuation shapes, the sphere, the capsule, the box, or the cone, you might still find it difficult in some areas to stop sounds leaking over to where you don't want to hear them. For example, if you have a building that's not a perfect box shape, how do you stop the rain from outside creeping across some of the walls without having to make dozens of small rain actors all around your building? If we take a look at an example blueprint here, we have nodes that perform certain functions and events are executed from left to right. Often we'll be using actor blueprints such as this that exist or are spawned into the level, but for this introduction we're going to use the level blueprint, which is the global blueprint for the whole level. In future videos we'll be looking at blueprints in a much more detailed way, but for the moment we're just going to create a simple system to deal with a problem that you might be having at this stage with overlapping sounds. If we look at the waterfall area, which is bookmark 5 of the demonstration level, we can see an illustration of the problem. Here we've got the waterfall, which is a source loop, and we've got a couple of one-shots for some birds in the trees. Now, the attenuations for these sounds have been set up so that they feel natural when approaching from this direction. But when we go into the cave, we'd expect these sounds to fall off differently, since the sounds would be blocked or occluded by these large rocks here. We'll look in a later video at how you can use audio volumes to imitate this kind of occlusion, but for the moment a simple solution, and one that's actually used in quite a lot of games, is to put a switch between the two places. As we go into this space, we'll fade out the sounds from the outside, and as we come back out, we'll fade those back in. So the first thing we want to do is to create a trigger at the cave entrance. So in our modes tab over here, we'll search for triggers, and we'll take a box trigger, put it there. I'll use the space bar to cycle through the widget so I can rotate it a little bit, flatten the trigger out, change its height. We want to make sure that the player is definitely going to collide with this trigger on the way in, so we'll put it all the way across the entrance. And then we'll open our level blueprint. With our trigger still selected in the level, we can right click here and add an event specific to that trigger box, collision, add-on actor begin overlap. So when the player walks through this event, it's going to trigger something to happen. Back in our level, we can select all three of the actors, and in the level blueprint, right click and create a reference to those three selected actors. And if we drag off of one, we can start typing fade out, which is what we want to happen, and we can attach the other two sounds to this as well. So what's happening here is it's creating an extra node in between because it's drawing out the audio component from within the ambient sound actor. So this is going to execute a fade out as we walk through that trigger. We want it to fade out over a period of time, not just cut off abruptly, and then we should be able to audition that in the level. We're outside, we can hear our sounds. And as we walk in, they fade out. Now, of course, the other thing we want to do is to fade the sounds back in on our way out. So essentially what we want here is a node that's going to toggle between fade out and fade in. So a good node for that is the flip-flop, which essentially executes from A, then B, then A, then B, etc. So if we drag out from here and we get the fade in, and then we make sure that targets all of our sounds, and then of course set a fade in duration and see how that sounds. And then it should, second time we come through the trigger, it should toggle that flip-flop. Fade in our sound. The other thing we'll probably want to do is to take the sound from inside the space and make sure that that is switched off until we want it to switch on. So in this instance it's not too much of a problem because this kind of cave wind sound is pretty much masked by the waterfall and the birds outside. But if you had, for example, a building with lots of machinery in it, You wouldn't necessarily want to hear those internal sounds when you're stood outside a wall of the building. So we want to make sure that that is switched off, and then we'll fade that in as we enter the cave and we'll fade it out as we leave. In other words, we'll do the opposite than what we've done for the ambient sounds outside. So the first thing is that cave sound at the moment is set to simply start when the level starts. So if we just collapse these categories so we can see them a bit easier, what we're looking for is activation, and at the moment it's set to auto activate. So if we turn that off, that sound's not going to start immediately. It's going to wait until it's faded in this instance. So we've got that actor selected in the level. We'll go to our blueprint, and same as before, we'll right click and we'll create a reference to that actor. We'll drag out from it, and the first thing we want to happen is for this sound to fade in as we enter the cave. And if you remember, that's coming from A, we fade out the outside sounds, and now we're fading in the inside sound. Remember to give it a duration. So it's going to fade in to volume of 1 over 1.5 seconds. And then of course, as we exit, we want again to do the opposite. As those sounds are fading in, we want this internal sound to fade out. So the cave sound should be off, and as we go in, the cave sound fades in. And as we go back out, the cave sound fades out. Now, this isn't a perfect representation of how audio acts in the real world. You'd clearly get some spillage of the sounds between these two spaces. But it is a simple solution, and it is used in quite a lot of games. If you loiter in doorways in games or move between spaces back and forth, you'll notice this happening. It's an easy way to solve what otherwise is quite a complex problem. The final thing we're going to do is to put in a bit of a safety system. There might be other actors moving around our level, and we don't necessarily want them to be triggering these sounds to fade in and fade out. We only want it to happen when the player character walks through this trigger. So we're going to get a reference to the player character, and we're going to find out what actor is overlapping on that trigger, and we're going to say, is that equal to the player character? In other words, is it the player character that's overlapping on the trigger? And that will give us a result that's a Boolean result, so it's either true or false. We're going to use that to control a branch, and the branch will output from true if it is the player character, so we do want our system to operate. And if it's not the player character overlapping with the trigger, if it's something else, we don't want anything to happen. We've started to use blueprints, and we've looked at simple interactions for switching sounds to get around difficult occlusion issues. There are other solutions to this that we'll look at in future videos, but triggers on entry and exit points to areas is a useful technique to have in your toolbox.